welcome to another episode of Hackers, Misadventures in Scale Modeling. Today, we're going to look at what some people think was one of the main reasons why Curtiss Aircraft Company went under. Now, it's not the main reason, but one of the reasons. So, this is the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver. So let's watch the video and see and listen what this gentleman has to say. Oh, this is also Rex's hangar, I believe. Hang on, just double check. Yeah, Rex's hangar. So let's have a go at it.
The Curtiss SB2C Helldiver is perhaps the best example of a potentially excellent aircraft design being ruined by uncompromising requirements. Entering service in 1942, at the height of the Pacific War between the United States and Japan, it was meant to be a replacement for the SBD Dauntless. The Helldiver was meant to be faster, better armed, and was meant to drop a far more potent payload onto the decks of various Japanese warships. It was also intended to be mass-produced on a scale not yet seen, thus equipping the US Navy and Army with an endless supply of dive-bombing aircraft. But, and oh my goodness is this a big but, the Helldiver would quickly earn such a poor reputation that it's often considered the trigger point for the downfall of Curtiss as an aircraft manufacturer. Its problems included, but were not limited to, poor power-to-weight performance, leaking hydraulic systems, leaking fuel systems, flaps that failed to retract, electrical systems that felt their use was optional rather than mandatory, landing gear legs that broke due to excessive weights, and the early models had such poor directional stability that the captain of the carrier USS Yorktown suggested that they be pulled from service and used as sea anchors. He hated them that much.
Wow.
Today's video should be considered an introduction to the saga that is the Helldiver, giving a general overview of the aircraft, and in the future we'll be covering the problem-plagued history of this machine in much more detail, specifically with a focus on its early development and why Curtiss was not to blame for this flying disaster. But today we're focusing just more on the aircraft itself, rather than the political and bureaucratic battle that raged on behind the scenes. And now, let's take a quick look at the ill-fated Curtiss Helldiver. Its origins can be traced back to 1938. Though the project that would materialize into the Douglas SBD Dauntless was still hammering out the final details of the first production model, the US Navy was already contemplating its successor. Rapid developments in aero-engine technology led the Bureau of Aeronautics to believe that an aircraft could be built along similar principles to the SBD, but on a slightly bigger scale, and with a much more powerful engine, and thus could carry their 1,000-pound bombs faster and further. Early in 1938, they issued a requirement for such a design. It was to be powered by the 1,500 horsepower, 14-cylinder Wright R2600 twin Cyclone. It was to carry a greater fuel load than the SBD without drop tanks. It was to carry a 1,000-pound bomb in an internal bomb bay, and it was to be sufficiently compact enough that 2 of these dive bombers could fit onto the main elevator of US Navy fleet carriers. This final requirement is where everything went wrong, because the US Navy was asking manufacturers to build an aircraft with greater internal capacity than any built before, whilst also limiting the maximum external dimensions, which, as many can appreciate, is something of a contradictory set of requirements. Specifically, this would have an impact on the overall length of any aircraft designed, and as such, Curtiss engineer Ray Blaylock was forced to submit a proposal for an especially short and broad aircraft, one that already looked a little unstable, that the Navy then ordered as the prototype SB2C-1 in May of 1939. As originally planned, it was a two-seat monoplane dive bomber. One of its most innovative features was an extensive hydraulic system, which would operate the landing gear, flaps, bomb bay, and the wing folding mechanisms, obviously with a manual backup as well. Armament would consist of two forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, and two 30 caliber machine guns were mounted on a ring in a similar fashion to those found on the SPD Dauntless. Airframe construction was metal, of course, the fuselage being a semi-monocoque, the wings built up on two spars in 4 sections, and everything bar the control surfaces had a stressed metal skin. As Curtiss-Wright's manufacturing plants were already committed to producing the P-36 and P-40 fighter aircraft, and as the Navy indicated they wanted a lot of these new dive bombers, construction of a new factory was initiated in Columbus, Ohio. Factories, however, did not sprout from the ground overnight, and as such, the prototype Helldiver was mostly constructed in a cattle barn on the state fairground. From this interesting beginning, problems soon began before the prototype was even completed. In February of 1940, wind tunnel tests on a scale model revealed unacceptably high stall speeds, to the point that the approach speed for carrier landings was considered dangerous. This necessitated the hasty redesign of the wings, which also increased their total area by about 10%, which itself increased weight, and this leads into the other problem. The aircraft's shape and mass would cause it to accelerate excessively when put into a dive for a bombing run, but due to time constraints, the only change made to address this was to provide variable opening capabilities of the flaps to act as impromptu dive brakes. With these further modifications made, the XSB2C-1 was completed and rolled out on December 13th, 1940. And although it had not even been tested in this new configuration, the Navy had already placed a production order for 370 aircraft. Said order would not be completed for some time though, as the prototype experienced a truly calamitous testing program. From its first flight on December the 18th, it was apparent to everyone that the XSB2C had some serious stability problems. The low speed characteristics, as predicted by wind tunnel tests, were questionable at best, and downright dangerous at worst. It had horrible stability in the yaw axis, and only marginal stability in pitch. And then there was the engine. Though the R2600 was becoming a reliable workhorse, its current configuration, combined with a new experimental 3-blade propeller, resulted in multiple failures, one of which led to a hard landing on February the 9th, which broke the prototype's back. Following repairs, testing continued throughout 1941 and revealed both the complexity of the design and its problems. During the year, multiple changes were made, including the lengthening of the nose and forward fuselage, the lengthening of the bomb bay, extending the cowl flaps, and making multiple alterations to the air scoop and the cooling systems. The tail was also increased in size to try and fix some of the worst of the stability problems, and things seemed to be somewhat improved when it was put through a new test program that ran from October the 20th until the prototype was destroyed on December the 21st when it broke up in a dive. Thankfully, the test pilot, Baron Hules, was able to bail out, as the wing and the tail had disintegrated at a fairly high altitude. But this catastrophic loss could not have been worse timed. Not only had the Navy increased its production order to well over 1,000 aircraft, but the US was now at war with Japan, and everybody was screaming for as many aircraft as they could get. The first production Helldiver should have rolled out of the new Columbus plant in December of 1941, but due to the ongoing problems and delays, this would not happen until April of 1942. By this point, there were over 4,000 Helldivers already on order, 3,000 to be built by Curtiss for the US Navy, and another 1,000 to be built in Canada. Some also intended for the US Navy, but some were also aimed at the Royal Navy as well. Due to the loss of the only prototype, and due to the many unanswered questions about the aircraft's general performance and structural integrity, the first 14 production Helldivers would be retained for research, development, and testing. To keep things simple for now, we're just going to look at the major production variants operated by the United States, and the other models will be covered in the deep dive video I have planned, which will also focus on the experimental variants of the Helldiver, as well as go into its service history in more detail. The SB2C-1 was not only the first production model, but it also served as an extension of the prototyping phase, as early models went through an extensive series of design revisions. Between the date of the original Curtiss proposal and that of spring 1942, the expected features of a modern combat aircraft had changed. The prototype did not include things such as self-sealing fuel tanks, a DF loop, radar, or armor protection for the crew, to name a few, but the production SB2C-1s did. Unfortunately, this increased the empty weight from 7,122 pounds to 10,144 pounds, or around 4,600 kilos, which had a knock-on effect on its performance. This was then further compromised by modifications to the armament, which now amounted to 4 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, not the nose, and a single 50 caliber machine gun in the rear for defense. Throughout 1943, a huge list of modifications began to build up, and as production of the Helldiver was well and truly underway, a second production line had to be set up purely to update the earlier models to the revised specifications. The SB2C-1 came in a Mod 1, Mod 2, and a Mod 3 variant, the last of which, when compared to the original design, featured almost 900 design changes.
Wow.
And it was not until the 601st Helldiver rolled out of the factory that all of the previous models had finally been brought up to a standard that the Navy would actually accept. By this point, the cumulative changes were recognized in a new model designation, the SB2C-1C, which technically began production after the 200th-1 model had been produced, but would still receive modifications for some time. The biggest change found on the new -C was the armament, with the 4 50 caliber machine guns in the wings being swapped out for a pair of 20mm cannons. The -1C would become the main production version of this initial series, with approximately 778 being built before things switched over to the -3 variant. The -1C was the first Helldiver to go to sea aboard a carrier as an active unit, with VB4 and VB6 working up with the type aboard USS Yorktown in May of 1943. By this point, the Helldiver already had a poor reputation, and it was often referred to as the Big-Tailed Beast, or simply as the Beast, and some claimed that its designation of SB2C stood for Son of a Bitch Second Class. There were, in fact, several other more imaginative and less delicate names for the Helldiver as well, but I will talk about those later. The Yorktown's early experience with the Helldivers was not pleasant at all.
Whoa.
There was an exceptionally high attrition rate due to landing accidents, either due to hook bouncing, landing gear collapses, or plain old-fashioned poor handling. The situation became so poor that near the end of the working up period, with deployment to the front looming, the Yorktown elected to swap back to the older SBD Dauntless, with its crews believing that they needed much more time to get to grips with this new and recalcitrant dive bomber. Because of this last-minute change, it would be the Helldivers of USS Bunker Hill that would see the type's combat debut, striking Rebel on November the 11th, 1943. After the Helldiver's disastrous start, the SB2C-3 represented the first shift in the right direction. Even with all the improvements, the Dash 1C models still had their problems. They were still difficult to control at low speeds, which led to numerous takeoff and landing accidents. They could not be put into a clean dive, as they encountered extreme tail buffeting, which led to a fatal loss of control, and then a high-speed plunge into either the ground, the ocean, or the deck of a Japanese warship. And they still suffered from the occasional mechanical problems, specifically hydraulic leaks and engine trouble. Now, some of these problems did stem from subpar workmanship coming out of the new Columbus factory, and were not a direct result of a design defect. So today I'm just going to focus on the design changes that improved the Helldiver, and we'll look at the other issues in the deep dive video. The biggest improvement found in the Dash 3 was an upgrade in the power plant, as it was felt that the Dash 1C was underpowered. The R2600-20 version of the twin cyclone was installed, and producing a healthy 1900 horsepower, driving a 4-blade propeller, it made for a huge improvement. Not only did the top speed increase from 281 to 294 miles an hour, or 473 kilometers an hour, but the added power gave pilots a bit more wiggle room when it came to carrier landings. This was further improved with later Dash 3 models, when perforated flaps and dedicated dive brakes were added. This further improved low-speed handling, and the number of deck accidents aboard carriers began to drop off dramatically. Approximately 1,112 Dash 3 models were built by Curtiss, plus another 413 SBW3s and 150 SBF3s were built by manufacturers in Canada, before things moved on to the SB2C-4. This was the most produced model of the Helldiver, with Curtiss producing 2,045 Dash 4 variants alone. It inherited all of the improvements found on the Dash 3, and the only major differences was the addition of a prop spinner, the deletion of the small windows behind the pilot's seat, and the fitting of 4 zero-length rocket launchers underneath each wing. Some Dash 4s were also equipped with airborne search radar, and these were known as the SB2C-4E. By this time it was late 1944, and although the Helldiver was finally performing well, indeed performing exceptionally well after roughly 1,000 modifications to the original design spec, the role of the dedicated dive bomber was becoming rapidly obsolete. The latest generation of carrier-borne fighter aircraft were able to carry the same amount of ordnance, up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, from the same carriers, and at a higher speed. And of course, they were fighters, which meant they could do considerable damage to enemy air units as well. This also meant that a version of the Helldiver intended for the Army Air Corps, known as the A-25 Shrike, was all but unneeded when it was finally ready for service in later 1943, thanks to the advent of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Approximately 900 of the A-25s were built, and after some negotiations, around 410 of these were reassigned to the Marine Corps. These would not see combat, however, as they were based on an earlier, less refined version of the Helldiver, and were instead used as trainers or target tugs. The Marine Corps would use the Dash 4 variant of the Helldiver, alongside the Navy, though many of their pilots would have gladly taken an F-6F Hellcat instead. The Helldiver did still have some advantages though. It could deliver its bombs more accurately as a dive bomber, and it could carry them across a greater range. This it did to admiration in the naval and land battles of the last 18 months of the Pacific War. Helldivers were put to especially good use during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where they took part in the aerial beatdown of the Yamato-class battleship Musashi in the Sibiyan Sea. During the course of the engagement with the 64,000-ton battleship, Helldivers from no less than 5 different US carriers would take part in the Musashi's gradual demise, scoring several direct hits without their wings coming off in the dive, much to the relief of their pilots. Wow. While the Dash 4 Helldivers were busy earning a belated and semi-decent reputation for themselves, production of the last major variant, the Dash 5, was getting underway. As the design was now considered mostly viceless, the improvements found on the Dash 5 were subtle. Internal fuel tankage was increased by around 35 US gallons. A new frameless canopy provided better visibility for the pilot. A 4-blade paddle propeller without a spinner was installed. The ASB radar was deleted, with an AN APS-4 radar pod as an optional modification instead, and the tailhook was now fixed in the extended position, owing to several mishaps with previous models that saw Helldivers shooting off the carrier deck and into the Pacific Ocean. Production of the Dash 5 began in February of 1945, and approximately 970 had been built by war's end, which saw the cancellation of future orders. The Dash 5 became the standard post-war dive bomber in naval squadrons, and although it was quickly replaced by the AD Skyraider, it is significant that the Helldiver was one of the few aircraft designed before the Pacific War that saw real service after its conclusion. The only other aircraft that outlasted it in this regard would be variants of the F-4U Corsair. But by 1950, the Helldiver had been entirely retired from active duty, with the aircraft being relegated to either training or testing roles, if they weren't scrapped, and by the mid-1950s, they had disappeared from the Navy inventory altogether. At the conclusion of its production run, 7,140 SB2Cs had been produced across more than a dozen different variants. They would see service not just with the United States, but with Australia, Britain, though none saw action, France, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Thailand. When it was retired, the aircraft was a far cry from the unreliable, slow, and dangerous beast that had first taken to the skies in 1940, but in many ways the damage had been done. The start of the Helldiver's career had been so spectacularly awful that its reputation never fully recovered, and by extension it was viewed as a black mark on the record of Curtiss Wright. Indeed, the early problems and production delays led to the project being investigated by the Truman Committee, which had been set up to investigate a whole series of delays, issues, and expenditure concerns found within the National Defense Program. This was the start of a troubling period for the company, one that saw it put most of its efforts into existing designs, such as modifying the P-40, or fixing the Helldiver, and because of this, Curtiss Wright began to lag behind in terms of aircraft development. In the post-war years, their failure to secure several key contracts for military aircraft projects, and an inability to adapt to the civil market would lead to them pulling out from the aircraft manufacturing business altogether. How much influence the Helldiver had on this fate is still up for debate, but it certainly had an impact. Unfortunately, this does nothing to improve its reputation, which is a bit of a shame as once the 1,000-odd kinks had been worked out, the SB2C became a pretty decent dive bomber. It fought in a multitude of creditable actions, it contributed to the sinking of a large amount of Japanese tonnage, and it even saw some post-war action with foreign operators. Had the Navy started with a more flexible design requirement from the outset, the future of the Helldiver, and perhaps Curtiss Wright, could have been very different. All of this and more will be explored in a deep dive video that I'm gradually working on. It's going to be pretty in-depth, covering the full saga of its early development problems, looking at the Truman Committee itself, the Helldiver's wartime service, foreign use, and some interesting experimental programs, including attempts to convert it into a torpedo bomber. But that is a much longer video for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course.
Well, that was interesting. Now, let's see what we got for kits of the Helldiver. Well, in 72nd scale, we have a early airfix kit. I haven't seen one yet, so I have no idea what the quality is like. It's probably typical airfix at the time. another company come out with it is Dragon, but in their what is the name of the thing? Wing Tech series, the Golden Wing series. Then we have, of course, the Matchbox kit, which always is a pleasure to build, but damn those trenches they have in the wings. Now, on 1/48 scale, we have the monogram Helldiver. Now, it started out in the blue box version. Then it got a modern, 2 modern boxings, and then the last boxing of it is a Revell kit. Well, before that it was a Pro Modeler kit, and then the last one is a Revell kit. Other Helldivers in that, one other Helldiver in that scale is the Accurate Miniatures kit. Now, for those who want a 32nd scale one, we recently been treated with one by a company called Infidane Models, which is a sub company of HPH Models. Now, HPH usually does resin kits, but they're being slowly transforming from resin kits to plastic kits, and this is a mold injected kit, and it's very, very well detailed, and it's very in depth in what it gives you. So that is about it for kits for the Helldiver. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video, and please remember to subscribe to my channel and punch that like button. You also can donate to my channel through my PayPal, which is on the main page of my channel, and you also can donate through Patreon. So, as always, every build is an adventure, so go make it awesome, and we'll see you again later. And you have a good day. Goodbye.